Welcome to Life, Love, and Jesus as we're continuing our journey through God's Word following a chronological reading plan. We are in the book of Nehemiah today, just getting started in this book, and I believe we'll be in the book for 3 or 4 days. And if you know anything about the history of Israel, you know that Nehemiah and Ezra, we finished Ezra yesterday, are contemporaries. They were living at the same time, basically, and working together to get the exiles who had returned to Judah back into a good place in the land by rebuilding the temple, getting them back in covenant relationship, following the Lord, following the law. And then in Nehemiah, we will see also rebuilding the wall around the city of Jerusalem and and setting them up for success and respect in the eyes of the nations. Because, of course, a city with no walls was not a city. It was a target. It was not respected. And so they needed to have those walls. And that is exactly how the book of Nehemiah starts. So with that said, let's just jump into this content. So Nehemiah is the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes, who is the king in the kingdom of Medes and Persian in Babylon, and he's over the entire kingdom. And Nehemiah is in a position of trust and authority, is a position of great power in the court of the kingdom. He is there in that position serving the king, but he is a Jew. And the Jews have been in the land for many, many years. They've been integrated into the society, but he's still a Jew. And he hears a report coming back from the exiles who have returned to the land. And he asks, how is it going? And they tell him, not so great, because the walls of the city are broken down. And so Nehemiah prays and he asks for the Lord's blessing, that he or the people would be able to once again be flourishing and blessed in the land. And that requires the wall of Jerusalem to be rebuilt, just because of the culture and the situation in terms of security of the day. And so he prays that. That's the end of chapter 1. He says in verse 11, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today. Grant him mercy in the sight of this king. So then we get to chapter 2. Now, chapter 1, when Nehemiah got the news, was in the winter, around January time. It says it's in the month of Chislev, which in my margin I've wrote, November, December time frame. And then chapter 2 takes place in the month of Nisan, and that is around the March, April time frame. So a few months later, he says he's in the presence of the king, and the king says, why are you sad? This is verse 2. And Nehemiah says, to himself, this is not good. I'm not supposed to be sad in the presence of the king. But then in verse 3, he says, I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And then the king said to him, what do you need? What do you request? So the king knew he was a Jew. The king knew what he was talking about. And then he says, well, what do you need? How can I help you fix this? And Nehemiah already had a plan. He told him what he needed, told him he needed to go there. He needed to oversee the work, how much supplies he needed from the treasury, all the things. And at the end of verse 8, and the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. We saw that same phrase in Ezra, the good hand of my God was upon me. And so God granted his request. He'd been praying for several months, and now the opening came, and the king said, what do you need? And God granted the request of all that he needed so that he could go to Jerusalem. And the rest of chapter 2 says that he arrived, and he wasn't welcomed with open arms. So he went out at night and he did an inspection of the walls. And when he did that, he came back to the leaders of the people there in the city, and he said, look, this is not good. We need to fix the walls. We need to honor our God. and the king has given me authority to do this. But there were those who opposed to him. And then verse 20, he says, then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will rise and build, but you have no portion or right or claims in Jerusalem. So right from the get-go, he's facing opposition, but he's also standing strong on the promise of God, first and foremost, but also the support and promise of the king. And so he begins then in chapter 3 immediately rebuilding the wall. And chapter 3 lists all the different families that are working on rebuilding the wall and the many different people that are involved in rebuilding the wall. And I wrote a list in the margin of my Bible, some of the people that are listed as participating in rebuilding the wall. High priests, this is in verse 1. Goldsmiths in verses 8 and 31. Perfumers in verse 8. Rulers in several places. Women are listed in verse 12. Levites in verse 17. Priests in a couple different places. Temple servants, gatekeepers, and merchants. So there's so many people that are working hard to get this done. They are working together to get this done. And chapter 3 just tells us this group's doing this part, and this group's doing this part, and this group's doing this part, and it's all the work is getting done. And then chapter 4, there's a lot more opposition that arrives. So at first they're just making fun of him and his plan, but then the work gets started, and then the real opposition comes. And again, as before, Nehemiah meets that opposition with prayer. And so the work on the wall continues, but so does the opposition to the work. And there are some people that are losing heart. And so Nehemiah gets up and he tries to encourage the people. And this is in verse 14. He says, I looked and rose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So he's telling them, look, God is on your side. Stand strong, fight against them, fix the wall, and fight against them at the same time. And in fact, it says later in that chapter that those who carried burdens loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon in the other. So they're working, but they're working while armed and ready for an attack. And that was in verse 17. So they continued working in spite of the opposition. And then in chapter 5, our last chapter for today, the work continues. But at the same time that the work continues, Nehemiah, who has been appointed not just to rebuild the wall, but as governor of the land of Judah by the king, he hears reports of oppression against the people because of what is happening between Jewish people. And he says, this cannot be. Some Jews are forcing other Jews into slavery. They're confiscating their fields. They're taking their produce. They're making their children slaves. And this is not good. Verse 6 tells us he was very angry about that. He goes and he confronts the people that are doing this. In verse 8, he said to them, we, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who've been sold to the nations. But you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us. So they're doing horrible things, trying to make a profit off of the suffering, misery, and poverty of their fellow Jews. And then verse 9, so I said, the thing that you are doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? And so the conviction came upon the people, and they agreed that they would stop doing this. And then Nehemiah, at the end of chapter 5, Nehemiah is not just telling the people to live lives honoring the word, honoring the Lord, taking care of the people, doing what was right. He is also doing that himself. As governor, he was entitled to tax the people and to take a portion of their food for daily rations and such. But in verse 15, he says, even their servants lorded over the people. Okay, but he says, But I did not do so because of the fear of the Lord. He was entitled to that support, that taxation, but he did not take it because he feared the Lord. And in fact, instead of doing that, he in verse 18 it says, "At my expense dinner meals were prepared every day, and I did not demand the food allowance of the governor because the service or the tax was too heavy for the people." So Nehemiah is living the kind of life that he expects everyone else to live. That's why he's so upset about the selling into slavery that has been taking place in chapter 5, and why he stands up for the oppressed that are suffering under that system so much, and says, nope, you've got to follow the law. This is not right. Release your brothers from their slavery and from their debts. So that's our content. And then we go to our 3 questions. What do I learn about the Lord? What do I learn about myself? And what do I need to obey, change, or do because of what I've learned in God's word today? And I just realized I am way over my 10 minutes. I am so sorry. But question number 2, what do I learn about myself? I can choose to work diligently and lead boldly as Nehemiah and most of the other people in Judah did, or I can choose to oppose God's plan subtly or overtly, or even by simply refusing to do the work. So this is something I did not point out earlier, that in verse 5 of chapter 3, it says the Tekoaites repaired the wall. Remember, it listed this group did this part and this group did this part. But their nobles would not stoop to serve their Lord. So I can refuse to work and in that way rebel against the Lord, even just by not doing anything. It is my choice. Am I going to work diligently? Am I going to serve boldly as Nehemiah did because God has called me to that? Or am I going to sit on the sidelines and let somebody else do the work instead? My choice. Thank you for joining me. Sorry I went over. I appreciate your patience and your just hanging in there with me. We will be back in Nehemiah again tomorrow. Please like and subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. I'll see you here again in chapter 6 tomorrow, and have a wonderful day living for the Lord.